The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect the policies and the position of Now You Know.
Good evening and welcome to Viewpoint. Together with experts and newsmakers, we make sense of the week's biggest issues and stories. I'm Barnaby Lowe in tonight's conversation.
It's been a year since ABS-CBN ceased airing on free TV. Lawmakers in the lower house denied the Philippines' largest broadcaster its license, despite concerned government agencies clearing the company of any wrongdoing. Employees have had to be laid off, and entire communities have lost key access to news and information. Throughout the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippines has consistently fallen on press freedom rankings. This year, it's 138th out of 180 countries, according to international media watchdog Reporters Without Borders. And while ABS-CBN and Rappler founder Maria Ressa, who's facing decades of jail time, are the most notable cases, journalists working for far smaller publications and stations have gotten arrested and killed.
And joining us on this discussion tonight on the state of press freedom here in the Philippines, as well as the first anniversary of the shutdown of ABS-CBN, is ABS-CBN correspondent Jeff Canoy, one of the most award-winning young journalists. Young ba? Young journalist.
Young Loki.
here in the Philippines. My friend Jeff Canoy, thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, Barnes. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. Joining us as well is the chair of the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines from Philippines Star Online, Jonathan De Santos. Good evening, Jonathan. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for having me here.
Jonax na lang, no?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I think everybody in the online world knows. Yung nickname mo naman is Jonax. Okay. All right. Let's start the discussion. We're already delayed. Siguro I will just warn our viewers that we've been having technical problems. So it's possible that it's a possible. Ayan. Meron tayong nadidinig na background noise at hindi ko alam kung saan po nanggagaling. Ayan na po yung sinasabi ko. Tayong mga technical problems. So we've had technical problems or so. So it's possible technical problems din po tayo. And I'd also like to say, caveat po, na hindi po spokesperson ng ABS-CBN si Jeff. Hindi rin spokesperson ng Philippine Star si this is their own personal capacity as well as in the case of chair of NUJP. All right, saan ba nanggagaling yung ano na yun? Meron tayong pang-apat na kausap. Interviewin ko na din siya.
Si Ate.
Okay. All right, okay, sige. I'll start with Jeff because syempre, just a few days ago was the first anniversary of the shutdown of ABS-CBN, and it's been, like I said, first anniversary here. How has this shutdown affected the morale of the employees of ABS-CBN?
It's a very tough question, I guess, but it's sort of a mixed feeling up to this point. Obviously, part of us are still raring to do some solid journalism, and we feel that what happened in the last year is just another challenge in how we gather news and try to deliver news to the people. And we're up to that challenge. We're still trying to do what we sort of swore to do when we got got into this job. But then I'd be lying if I don't say that, it's been also very difficult, especially since I always say that what happened last May 5 was a collective trauma. Um, for us as an institution, we always have to uh, para siyang strange eh. There's times na parang, okay, we're doing our job, we're doing our work, and then suddenly, without warning, you're sort of reminded by that trauma of what happened on May 5. And even the most mundane, random things sort of trigger you. Parang ako, I remember specifically kapag papasok ako ng ABS-CBN offices, tapos meron kami yung sinaswipe, di ba, to gain access. Yung mga little things na pa nagsiswipe ako, biglang suddenly, parang may isip ko na thousands of other employees of ABS-CBN aren't able to do that now. So parang biglang the floodgates open and all the trauma from the last year sort of, di ba, come crashing. And
May mga
when
may mga pictures ka nga na, may mga photos ka na from last year, May 5th, na ngayon mo lang na post, ano? Hindi mo kaya.
So hirap eh so we did this project in the last few weeks, or last week we had to get an oral history of some sorts from different people from ABS-CBN, and it forced us to go to our memory banks, both technologically and psychologically, na kailangan namin buksan yung mga SD card na hindi namin nabuksan, yung mga memories sa tinabi mo para makapag-function ka pa bilang journalist, tinabi mo. Pero napuwersa kami to confront that. And it was a very difficult week, actually. Just going back to that moment that the shutdown happened. Because it's not just that day, it's everything else that followed. For us, it was the day that the whole nightmare sort of started.
Jonax, is it also difficult for other journalists na hindi naman nagtatrabaho sa ABS?
Well, yeah, of course. Well, siguro unang-una kasi, no, syempre we feel for our colleagues sa ABS-CBN. Parang, it's easy to parang look at us as parang individual practitioners lang, no, na we do our story and that's it. Pero, knowing na may ganitong nangyari sa ABS-CBN, syempre, ano rin siya, well, obviously, it's not the same trauma, but may pain din doon just watching it happen, ano. And also, may effect din kasi siya on all other practitioners na parang, oh wow, grabe yung nangyari, and parang mapapaisip ka rin, maybe you'll be next, no, if you cross some line.
So this is what they're calling the chilling effect?
Definitely, no. May nabasa akong column saying na no true journalist would be scared, no. Parang ano yan, parang bago lang yan sa, parang kailangan matapang ka, diba? Right? Just go do your job. Pero syempre, we can't deny na even if we just mapapause ka lang when you're doing a story, yun, chilling effect na yun, na you're already chilled na parang, should I be doing this? Should I pursue this story? No. Yun. So definitely, yun, it is a chilling effect.
Oo. So, Jeff, yung chilling effect na yon, nararamdaman ba yun sa ABS-CBN, or dahil wala naman na kayong franchise, so parang naging mas matapang ba yung reporting niyo?
Ang hirap kasing sabihin na matapang ang isang journalist or ang tapang ng story ang to, because I think all of us here, working journalists, we don't really think about those things. We just do the story. Kaya ang hirap sabihin na, ang tapang ko sa story to, kasi hindi naman yung nasa isip ko eh. What you're thinking of is, I just have to do the story. So, but going back to your question, na tama yung sabi ni Jonax na yung pause, yun yung nakakatakot. That's the scary part of this, especially for ABS-CBN journalists. I can't speak for others, but ako may mga moments na if I do this story, will diba? Will I cause more trouble for my coworkers? Will this result to another with another clampdown on democratic spaces? Will this cause other employees of ABS-CBN to lose their jobs? So may ganong pause but at the end of the day, we're still committed to doing the story that we want to do. Pero the fact na nag-pause ka, yun yung nakakatakot eh. Kasi hindi mo dapat iniisip yun eh. Iniisip mo lang dapat is to do the story and to deliver it, di ba? Wala dapat pause. Dapat yung focus sa work.
Yeah. Okay. Medyo na-distract ako sa...
Ako rin, sorry. Yung train of thought ko medyo naliligaw dahil kay...
So I understand. Okay. But what you're saying is, of course, at the back of your mind, meron talaga mga concerns na ganon. Pero, Jonax, meron pang ibang concerns. I mean, of course, what happened to ABS-CBN is a huge concern na in a way na pwede siyang mangyari sa kahit sino sa atin, di ba? Pero yung red tagging, is that a bigger concern?
Well, it's a big concern, no? Parang siguro it's not as highlighted. I mean, although recently medyo in the news siya, no? Kasi for like journalists in the regions, no? For example, si Kim Abalos of Northern Dispatch, umakyat siya sa Tinglayan from Baguio City, no? Tapos, while they were having lunch, may coverage sila doon. While they were having lunch, nilapitan sila ng town police and sinabihan sila na, yung mga people from leftist groups aren't welcome here. So ganon, ano siya eh, as we've seen, yung red tagging kasi nagiging ano siya, justification for harassment, nagiging justification siya for denying you access siguro to stories, no? So yeah, definitely it's an issue, and marami siya recently nitong out of like more than 50 incidents of intimidation na natali ng NUJP and CMFR, no? Around 30 I think are red tagging. So ano siya, very prevalent siya na threat or na
on journalists specifically, no?
Yep, on journalists, yes.
On journalists. And where do you see this happening most often? In the big cities, in the smaller towns?
Mostly sa smaller towns. For example, meron sa Cagayan de Oro, related ito sa community pantries. May nag-put up ng posters linking Cagayan de Oro journalist to the Communist Party. Parang ang nangyari is, since this journalist wrote about the community pantries, and since this journalist was identified already, parang pinupush nila na member siya ng Communist Party. Therefore, parang ang logic of that was, therefore, itong community pantry is a project of the Communist Party. Parang ganun, ano? Mostly sa regions siya, pero we've seen din na it's happened in NCR. Earlier this year, may Inquirer reporter na ni-red tag na in general, no? So, hindi na siya limited, let's say, to the regions. Napakalapit na nila to reach out and touch us, parang gano'n.
So having said that, are journalists working for smaller publications, smaller stations, and what they call the alternative media, yung mga nasa at saka yung mga nasa probinsya nga, are they in a sense more in danger?
Yes, definitely. I think kasi dito sa Metro Manila, we're relatively safer. Kasi sa regions, pwede ka nilang puntahan sa bahay, pwede ka nilang puntahan sa station mo. Bibisitahin ka talaga, no? Or kahit sa sa posters lang. Like if it were to happen here, parang hindi ka naman masyadong matatakot na parang this is Manila, no? Pero pag sa regions kasi, pwede kang puntahan nga sa bahay, pwedeng habang, let's say, namamalengke ka, maharas ka, ganyan. It's a smaller community, so, tas malayo siya sa center, so attention isn't really there. So yun, mas open ka talaga to harassment.
So in that sense, that is parang that's part of the deteriorating press freedom in the Philippines.
Yes,
I mean,
oo.
yeah,
Mm.
go ahead.
Ayun nga, kasi tumataas siya, no? And even if mapapatigil ka lang to report on, let's say, farmers' issues, or let's say may land dispute that you want to cover pero labeled ka as na red tag ka na, pwedeng mapatigil ka from covering, or even if just tamaan yung credibility mo na, oh, this person is writing about this kasi komunista siya, or this person is writing about this kasi propagandist siya for rebels. Yung report mo, may ganun may kulay na agad na ganun. So, yeah, definitely.
Pero Jeff, may mga Pilipino nagsasabi, tuloy naman yung tuloy naman yung negosyo ng ABS-CBN, tuloy naman yung mga journalists, pupunta sa West Philippine Sea, nagpupunta sa mga disaster zone. So where is there no press freedom?
Well, obviously, nakita natin lahat nitong epekto. I think na-highlight siya lalo nung Typhoon Rolly, Typhoon Ulysses. I think sa social media, di ba, there was a huge demand from people asking, nasaan yung mga stories about Catanduanes, or about Cagayan, or about Tugigaraw? Nasaan yun? Doon pa lang makikita mo na yung difference from before, na yung mga regional reporters namin, for example, were there as our frontliners. They were the first ones to deliver the news. Ngayon, lahat maasa kami either sa citizen journalists, sa stringers, or talagang manggagaling sa Manila. So obviously may epekto sa ganung extent of coverage. And in the same way, hindi naman namin sinasabi na dahil porket walang ABS, walang impormasyon. Pero there are so many places in the Philippines na signal lang ng ABS-CBN yung nasasagap. I specifically remember Bagyong Ambo from last year. Right after the shutdown, I was assigned to cover Typhoon Ambo in Aurora. Sa Aurora pa lang, maraming places na ABS-CBN lang yung accessible sa free TV. So imagine, hindi lang yung freedom of hindi lang yung press freedom yung affected, but yung people yung access to information, obviously mas nalimitahan sila. Yung iba wala talaga.
Yung
and
reach.
That is part of yes, kasi parang 'di ba, yung we're supposed to live ideally in a world where we get information that will help us decide on things, on how to protect our families, on how to go about our daily lives. Pero if that line to information was suddenly cut, and for some places that's the only line to their information, then obviously there's a problem, di ba? Yun yung press freedom. It's not just the ability to write, not just the ability to inform, pero yung audience mo, parang, di ba, the fact na yung line na yon has been cut, that's part of our freedom for information and for the press.
And the other thing that you mentioned is, I think, news gathering. You mentioned it briefly. How severely debilitated is your ability to gather news?
Well, there's two things to factor into that. Aside from the shutdown, there's also the pandemic, and I think we've all experienced so many limitations in how we cover news now. Most of the things that we do now are, especially for press conferences, for example, are all virtual. And diba, kung sino yung host, they get to control who asks the questions, diba, how much time you have. So aside from that pandemic issue, obviously yung manpower namin, it's limited. Kasi before I pitch a story about Marawi, for example, the COVID situation in Marawi. And before, without question, our newsroom would probably send me to Marawi to be on the ground, to bear witness, to gather news there. Pero now there are financial considerations as well. Obviously, yung bulk of what ABS-CBN earned before isn't what we're earning now. So there are budget cuts, considerations na should we prioritize putting funding in this coverage instead of this one. So in that regard, may effect din, di ba? Hindi na siya parang before na when you pitch a story that you think should be uh, placed on a national level, hindi na ganun kadali. Sometimes they'll just ask you to, if you know someone, if you have an asset there, maybe they can help you build that story. Pero paano pag wala, di ba? And I think yun yung masaklap yung mga community stories, yun yung naapektuhan Kasi hindi mo na siya ma-elevate into a national story because of the resources.
So shutdown na pandemic pa. Jonax, if you could talk about more about how the pandemic is affecting news gathering capabilities, the reporting that we do. Because Jeff mentioned one thing I also experienced, of course, with press conferences online now via Zoom or any other similar platform. And in my case, I cover a lot of health-related stories. So I cover the DOH a lot, and you'd have to submit your questions in advance. And you don't know if they're going to read out your question. So that's one. But are there more challenges which exacerbate the issues press freedom is experiencing?
Well, siguro not so much now, pero remember nung start nung lockdown, they required us to register for accreditation IDs na 50% lang of the staff would be allowed, ano? Maraming probably lahat ng alternative media outlets hindi sila binigyan ng accreditation ID. I don't think it stopped them from covering, pero potential problem yun, ano. Saka ngayon din, given yung economic effects ng lockdown, a lot of newsrooms, hindi, or lalo na kung kunyari freelance journalist ka in the province, no, mahirap mag-ikot for you. Unang-una dahil sa movement restrictions. At pangalawa, dahil syempre safety, you need PPEs, ganyan. And ayun din, limited din yung transportation, ano. So a lot of stories na from the community sana hindi na maabot sa atin, and maraming regional journalists they're forced to rely on parang official statements, police reports or military reports. So oo nga, may storya ka pero kulang siya, or yun lang yung makukuha mo storya. Ano rin siya, parang it's a restriction in itself na hindi ka makalabas sa field to get stories from the ground, and you have to rely on these releases nga.
Oh, so how, as an editor, how do you go around these difficulties with your reporters?
Kaya naman siya, like, a lot of the time pwede ka mag-Zoom, I suppose, or pero hindi pa rin siya exactly na nasa ground ka, no? I think may magandang ginawa yung Rappler earlier in the lockdown na they asked a student in, I forget, let's say Romblon, na take a video naman of yung situation mo for distance learning, na parang umaakyat pa ng puno yung bata just to get signal. Tapos ang ginamit nilang video was the video na shoot ng estudyante. So there are ways around it, yes. Pero in general, may restricted talaga tayo. Restricted yung movement natin.
Ikaw, Jeff, as a reporter yourself, syempre, editor, ikaw reporter ka. You have to be on the ground and you have to be reporting the story. How do you go about these problems?
When the whole pandemic started, di ba, parang may blanket, since nobody really knew how to cover a pandemic. I mean, we have training, but we weren't trained for this. And I think it goes for all newsrooms across the world, diba? They were sort of still blindsided by it. Na how do you cover this pandemic safely? So when the pandemic started here in the Philippines, there was a blanket rule na and I think it goes not just this goes beyond the ABS-CBN newsroom, that you shouldn't go to places where there's a high number of COVID cases. You shouldn't go to hospitals. And I tried following that rule in the first few weeks, but I found it so difficult and impersonal. It was so weird for me to take time away from medical frontliners and doctors to ask them to film things and to do interviews on virtually. So I really fought to actually go inside hospitals and COVID wards because this is what we're supposed to be trained for. Things that doctors and medical frontliners might not be able to identify as important or as a as a important story. Journalists will be able to do that because that's training. So I really fought for coverage at the start of the pandemic inside COVID hospital. So yun yung weird part kasi di naman tayo trained ako personally, hindi ako trained na mag-donning and doffing of PPEs. Pero ngayon parang I sort of had to learn it and be an expert of it. So yun yung iba pa rin for you to be on the ground.
But that's your choice.
That was my choice. It wasn't.
But, yeah.
But there was a lot of discussions among journalists, my colleagues, for example. Now, why are you willing to risk it? Pero sabi ko kasi parang at this point, you can sort of get the virus anywhere. At least in the hospitals, you have PPEs, but you have added defense. So it was essentially a long debate. But it's still I still find it very difficult to cover the news when you're just behind the screen. I think it's still a bit better if you're there on the scene, if you're there on the ground. And even for press conferences, for example, di ba, parang yung culture here in the Philippines is if you have more questions and they don't accommodate you during the press conference, you do an ambush interview to do your follow-up questions, di ba? To really grill that personality.
Kahit walang follow-up.
Kahit
Ambush.
di ba? Now, di ba? Ambush. Hapangan natin sa banyo o sa labas or bago matapos yung event, papalibutan natin or i-corner mo to ask more questions, to press certain issues. Pero ngayon ang hirap kasi nasa kanila yung control Patayan ka lang ng Zoom, patayan ka lang ng mikropono, wala kang choice. So until now, I still find it very, very difficult to really cover the news virtually. Especially pag may mga quarantine lockdowns. Pero so, as much as possible, kung may choice to do field work, I still opt to do that. Pero syempre nga, ang choice na yon, it comes with the risk, di ba? Na you're putting yourself,
calculated risk, di ba?
Calculated risk. Kasi iba pa rin, iba talaga.
Oo, yeah. So, I mean, just moving on from that, Jonax, we're talking about covering the situation, the pandemic situation, either virtually or on the ground. And I think iba-iba yung opinion ng mga journalists dyan. And sa mga newsroom, Jonax, I'm sure pagka ganitong situation, I don't know, I'm just assuming na you let the individual journalist decide for himself. Ano?
Sa newsroom namin at least, no, like that's your call. Kasi hindi naman din biro ito, no. But like, obviously, parang ideally you'd be on the ground, no. Pero get the story. Bahala ka how you do it. Tapos syempre, stay safe din. Kasi pag nagkasakit ka naman, it doesn't serve anyone.
Pero ito,
hindi ko sinasabi na yung ginawa ko is again, it boils down to what the journalist will decide. Kasi nga, di ba, if you die from this virus, then ano pang silbi mo sa lipunan, di ba? Hindi ka na makakapagkwento. Babalik tayo sa any conflict zone or any dangerous assignment is no story is worth dying for. Mas may silbi ka sa lipunan kapag buhay ka at nakakapagkwento ka pa.
Pero ito ngayon ang tanong, because we have a choice between covering remotely or going to the hospitals and going out in the streets. Pero yung kay President Duterte, how, Jonak, siguro sa'yo ko i-direct itong question na ito, since you're an editor and you are the chair of NUJP. How do you think our journalists are faring in the coverage of President Duterte?
Well, no, in a way kasama parang captive tayo in the same way na captive yung audience when they air those briefings, no. Hindi naman tayo pwede magtanong, hindi naman that's we're pretty much left to make sense of what he said, which is a challenge in itself, no. Sa newsroom namin, kasi syempre we have to carry the live stream, no. Pero we minimize yung live tweeting. We hardly write stories about the briefing now. On one hand kasi parang you've seen the briefings naman, no? Mahirap siyang gawin, mahirap siya i-cover. And naman siya if it's not a policy statement, parang we will leave it for the next day na lang. Ideally, we were not covering it live. Parang ganun. Kasi, ano ba yun? Tapos the next day, i-explain naman sa atin ng palasyo, di ba? Parang, hindi ko makita yung advantage for us to be doing this.
So, nag-evolve yung coverage niyo since the start of the pandemic? Because I noticed during the start of the pandemic, very extensive yung media coverage of President Duterte's weekly speeches. And then you're saying na as the weeks went on, as the months went on, nag-iba yung coverage ninyo.
Oo, kasi nung first part of nung pandemic, hectic yan parang round the clock may balita talaga. And then eventually parang ito ulit-ulit naman sinasabi niya or may sasabihin siya pero i-contextualize the next day. Parang at least sa newsroom namin we decided na parang pahingahin na lang natin yung tao or there's not a lot to gain from kunyari i-break natin itong sinabi niya lang naman, wala naman siyang sabihin niya lang arrest nyo yung mga hindi nakasuot ng mask, pero how do you operationalize that? Kinabukasan pa yan malalaman So, yun. At least sa newsroom na we decided na sige, bukas na lang.
But is this the fault of Philippine media that this is how we're reporting on President Duterte?
Hindi naman fault, I suppose. Pero kasi presidente siya, so pretty much whatever he says is newsworthy. So we do have to, parang kailangan siyang bantayan, Pero hindi natin kailangan, personally, ako lang naman to, hindi natin kailangan sakyan lahat na sinasabi niya. Hindi natin kailangan i-take seriously yung mga sinasabi niya na parang, baka naman, kunyari, sabi niya, sasapakin niya si former Foreign Affairs Secretary Del Rosario, Yun.
Okay.
It's just a thing that we said.
Okay. So yung mga bluster niya, you don't think na we have to cover each and every bluster that he says on TV. Okay. I'll ask Jeff about, because you don't cover Malacanang, obviously, but maybe not obviously. Not everybody knows it. But you don't cover Malacanang and you don't cover President. But occasionally you do have to live tweet. And, some newsrooms have, unlike the Philippine Star, I guess, have decided that they would live tweet all the speeches. Maybe some would call them speeches, some would call them just live briefings of President Duterte. What is, if you don't mind, what is your opinion on this? Because may divide din dito may criticism ng mga journalists na nagla-live tweet without contextualizing. But then again, how easy is it to contextualize while you're live tweeting? You're listening and you're transcribing and then you're live tweeting. I guess the question is it already a story when you're live tweeting?
No, kasi it's a developing story, obviously. Things change as you go along. yung live tweeting, I think it really boils down to the institutional knowledge of the beat reporter. I covered Camp Crame for 7 years, and I've noticed a difference every time there's someone who goes in to Camp Crame as a reliever, for example, from whatever news organization. Parang may different appreciation of the events or facts because yung naabutan nila, yun lang yung, and it's not to their fault, pero parang yun lang yung reportable nila. Pero if you're a beat reporter, you should be able to instantly call back. Yun yung task mo as a beat reporter. You're supposed to be the master of your beat, di ba? So if something happens or if a certain official says something, dapat parang automatic may notes ka or may recall ka of an institutional memory na nangyari to nung 2 years or 3 years or 4 years ago na para ma-contextualize mo kung ano yung sinasabi. Obviously, this is easier said than done, but I think it really helps if, yun nga, parang yung mga nagla-live tweet are the beat reporters kasi ikaw yung araw-araw nagko-cover nun eh. So if something happens, you should be able to immediately call back to a connection to a previous story. So to provide those following the live tweets with, diba, additional context. So yeah.
But would it be okay to follow up with, an article for the context? I mean, the live tweet is the live tweet, and then you have either an online or print article or a TV package to contextualize the story right after all the live events.
Hindi, kasi hindi naman lahat after you do a live tweet of a certain event will go look for the article or the TV story, di ba? Parang hindi naman nila hahanapin yun to get the context eh. Kaya yun yung mahirap eh. I think it takes a different skill set talaga to sort of provide context while the coverage is ongoing. Kasi ang hirap eh, especially at a time when our officials are either blatantly giving us weird information or, di ba, parang misinformation or disinformation, or they too are so confused with what the policy is na ang hirap if you don't put context eh. Kasi parang immediately, for example, if you tweet something na sabi ni DILG Undersecretary ito. So pag na-retweet yon at kumalat at nag-viral, parang for them, yun na yung parang last touch mo sa story eh. So parang as much as possible, kung malagyan mo na ng context in itself, dahil yun yung mababasa ng mga tao, then mas okay, di ba? Kasi hindi naman natin ugali na if you see a tweet, yun yung, I guess, challenge din talaga. Kasi nga hindi rin siya madali eh. Hindi rin talaga siya parang automatic na maiisip mo na, kailangan ko lang. Pero, yun nga, as much as possible, if you spot a lie, if you spot disinformation, then you might as well correct it on the spot with the proper context. Kasi yun yung mga tao hindi naman, most of the people, hindi sila magsi-second step to look for the actual story eh.
It's really a different era because I'm old enough to recall the days when we didn't have to live tweet.
I'm old enough to say na wala pang Twitter nung nag-start ako. So hindi siya part ng skill set natin. Kaya actually na-amaze ako sa mga campus journalists ngayon if you look at their Twitter accounts.
Yes.
Sobrang parang part ng training nila na mag-live tweet. Kasi ako, it's something that I just learned in the last, 5-10 years. Kasi nung nag-start tayo, wala naman yun eh. Yung skill set na yun eh.
Yeah. Pero, okay. So, Jonax, si Jeff, he mentioned yung information, a lot of the information that we're getting right now is being fed to us, literally, by government officials. How do you choose which to report? Let's just say, for example, I'm going to give a very striking example here, and I hope nobody gets offended by this, but Senator Bongo, of course, aide of President Duterte, laging sa kanya nanggagaling yung mga photos, videos, and yung mga announcements even na parang dapat executive function pero sa kanya nanggagaling. And then of course we have photos from him na kumakain lang si President Duterte or he's riding his motorcycle. I mean, ito ba, how do you sift through these materials and information?
Well, syempre, no, ideally, itong information and photos na ito would come from the palace, no. I think parang there's effort naman on media's part to um, parang verify it with the palace. Pero syempre hindi mo rin masisisi yung mga kasama natin sa industriya, no. Meron ka info galing kay Bongo, for example, or meron kang picture. So, hindi ba sila masisisi for using that? Pero kung ako lang, or at least sa newsroom namin, we wouldn't do that. Kasi paano kung mali siya? Paano kung mali yung info na binigay niya? Hahabol ba natin siya? Hindi rin. I don't think we can hold him accountable for that. Kasi parang tayo yung sumakay dun sa paandar nila eh. Hindi naman siya palasyo, exactly. At sinasabi naman niya, hindi siya spokesperson. So, anong habol natin if it turns out to be wrong or if it turns out to be framed a certain way pero hindi naman talaga yun yung nangyari, di ba? It will fall on us. So, parang kumbaga, sumakay na tayo doon sa paandar, credibility pa natin yung tatamaan if it turns out to be wrong.
So does it feel like Philippine media right now is losing control of narratives?
Siguro, not man losing control, but let's say may political strategists sila, no? They know how to take advantage or parang maximize the processes of media for them to get the most exposure, for example, or to take control. So medyo parang to take control of the narrative. Alam na nila how we work. For example, alam nila na if they air this briefing, this talk to the people at this time, manonood tayo eh. I-cover natin siya eh. So, medyo captive tayo sa processes natin.
Oh. And para sa iyo naman, Jeff, I forgot to ask this. I should have asked this in the beginning of the program. Yung trolls, yung mga attacks online, how has that affected your work? Or personally?
Yeah. So, ako, believer ako na out of sight, out of mind. So if you don't see it, it doesn't really affect you. But if you do it, it does have a lot of effect din talaga on how journalists parang give information. Now, knowing na parang lagi mo parang you sort of have to mentally prepare yourself na if you do the certain story, parang may mga certain stories na alam mong may troll campaign who will attack you. And that hindi lang, and ako, dumating ako sa point na you also sort of have to prepare your family members as well. Kasi parang kung ikaw okay lang eh, parang kaya mo, that's parang part and parcel of what you signed up for as a journalist. Pero yung pamilya mo hindi naman eh, di ba?
Is it part and parcel?
In this age, parang yun na yung realidad eh. Hindi ko naman sabing, obviously hindi dapat, pero ang realidad is, ganun yung mundong ginagalawan natin na may mga certain stories na mapupuno yung inbox mo at talagang iaharas ka. And it's much worse actually for our female, di ba, colleagues. Talagang parang may mga threats of rape. And anyway, pero yung mas scary part with the troll attacks, ilabas mo na yung sarili mo. I've had many experiences where yung subject mo mismo yung ia-attack. Na yun yung mahirap eh. Kasi di ba parang as journalists, we're supposed to do no harm to our subjects. So parang pag may mga certain stories na ako talagang sinasabi ko sa subject na or sa yung gustong magbigay ng kwento, na you also have to be prepared. Kailangan maging transparent ka rin sa kanila na kasi may mga stories ako na talagang especially yung Marawi time na may mga magsasalita tapos sila mismo yun yung hindi ko na-anticipate before na sila mismo yung i-attack yung subject na ang sakit for a journalist, di ba, na they trusted you with the story tapos parang it's so out of your hands eh. Parang ano bang magagawa mo to help protect them, di ba? Ang hirap. I haven't really gotten to a place where I'm really parang I've developed what my position is on this. Pero yun yung problem is parang beyond the attack on the journalist, very prevalent din yung attack on the subjects that you're interviewing or yung case study that you're working on, you're working with. Ang hirap eh. Nakakasakit din when you see them be attacked online.
Actually, since you mentioned that, and since you mentioned first rule is do no harm, Jonax, medyo malaking issue yung mga naging, let's just say, way of asking certain personalities ng mga reporters recently. And ito nga, let's just give as an example, the most recent example, yung community pantries. So may mga journalists, and I won't single them out, but a few journalists who were criticized on social media for not being sensitive enough. Pero meron naman mga journalists na nagtanggol talaga dito sa mga colleagues natin, saying na it's an important question, it's a question that needs to be asked, and that's our job. Our job is to ask the hard questions. So may moment ba ng self-reflection dito, Jonax?
Well, ano siguro, no? Like, well, very extensively discussed naman na yung question na yun, no? Ano lang siguro, we have to keep in mind na as in live tweeting, as in ito yung mga streamed interviews, ano na siya we can say na sige, they can look at the body of work, they can look at the full story to get the kung paano talaga tinreat yung subject, no? Pero part na kasi ng information gathering process, part na nung how we deliver the news itong fact na that we're constantly online and under scrutiny talaga tayo, no? Kunyari, yung live tweets, we can argue na hindi naman yan yung buong storya eh. Or this one question, hindi naman yan yung buong storya eh. Pero, part of the story na yun. And for a lot of people, yun na lang yung makikita nila, no? So, yes, we have to ask the hard question. We have to ask difficult questions, no? Pero I think there is a way to ask these questions na bearing in mind na itong interview subject na to might be exposed to harassment, might be exposed to other risks. Para yung kwento nga ni Jeff, yung mga case studies niya, baka ma-expose sila to harassment. Ganun din. Yun lang, it's something to keep in mind. It doesn't mean we shouldn't ask questions. It doesn't mean we shouldn't probe into a person's background. Pero yun lang, we need to be mindful then how that comes across. Hindi lang to the audience, pero parang if you're asking kunyari ano ang basis, parang the burden of disproving or parang showing na walang basis is on the person you're asking kasi.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, does it yung recent na discussions on this, yung recent na mga criticism against some of our colleagues, do you think about that? Is it now limiting your ability to ask questions?
I think it's very easy to criticize in hindsight. To say I could think of a better question or I could think of a better way to frame a certain question. It's very easy to do that. Pero yun nga parang very difficult kasi talaga na nabanggit ni Jonax na everything is online. Yung process ng interviews or press conferences na before reserved for journalists lang, yung physical space na yun, tapos lalabas na lang yung storya mo. Hindi na siya so parang mas na-democratize na yung proseso ng pagtatanong, di ba? Mas may access na to people, transparency. So I think we just have to be very mindful then. I think, yun nga, at the end of the day, ang mangunguna dito is do no harm eh. Parang kung ikaw ay iniisip mo na ayaw mo mapahamak sa certain story, lalo naman yung mga kino-cover, yung mga, especially people who are obviously under threat, hindi ayaw mong palalain yung situation nila. So I think sensitivity and a lot of empathy, parang it will go a long way in terms of how we cover the news.
Okay.
Pero yun, mahirap din mag-judge kasi magsabi na mali yung tanong mo, ito yung dapat na tanong, kasi we all have the benefit of hindsight. We all have the benefit to sort of sit back and say, ganito ko itatanong yung tanong. It's very different when you're in the moment. Pero yun nga, parang at that moment, kailangan laging umiral yung empathy mo for the whoever you're interviewing. Lalo na kapag yung taong yun ay nasa position na under threat, or especially now yung government forces can sort of use that moment to, di ba, parang make something completely false more true. Ayaw mong maging contributor to that.
Well, we're going almost 1 hour na pala. Gumanda na kasi yung connection, so napasarap na yung usapan na.
Nawala na si ate, medyo na-miss ko siya.
Wala na si ate, tapos wala na tayong delay. Diba? Ay, na naman si ate.
Binati natin kasi.
Binati kasi. So I'll just ask one final question, and you may choose to answer or not to answer, because I know that syempre, you're answerable also to your bosses. But I just want to ask, because we've been declining in press freedom rankings in the last 5 years of the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte. So 138th out of 180 countries. That's a pretty dismal ranking. But I also read that 19 journalists have been killed during the Duterte administration, and 30 were killed during the administration of former President Noynoy Aquino. And of course, we all remember na Maguindanao massacre, of course, dozens of journalists killed in just one day. So I just want to, if you can, is this the fault of President Duterte and his administration, or is it more as a social and systemic problem? Siguro let's start with Jonax.
Well, ano naman, no? Kasi what we echo, at ever since, kasi parang under threat naman talaga ang media, no? Totoo nga yun, no? I did look that up. Mas marami nga talaga namatay ng panahon ni President Aquino. Siguro ano din, it's not his fault, pero he has contributed to it. Na-bring up to kanina sa Makluhan Fellow Forum, no? Na how he treats media is a sign, or parang parang the officials take cues from him. Also, nag-shift na rin kasi, not just in the Philippines, no, across the world, yung threat to media na lawfare. So it's using legal processes, using regulatory processes to silence the media. So isang banda, yeah, that's good in the sense na it means they don't have to kill you to silence you, no? Pero that doesn't mean that it's safer now. Iba lang yung tactics ngayon. And yun, like parang tayo naman, no, we've been covering since Aquino and Arroyo, we just have to be parang watchful for these attempts to silence us, diba?
Okay.
Also,
Sige, go ahead.
ayun lang, parang hindi rin naman kasi siya siguro sa bilang ng mga kung ilan ang namatay. But kung paano yun, parang kunyari may namatay, how does the government treat it? Meron na, do they solve it? Do we get justice for those deaths? Ano siya, overall contributory siya to a climate of impunity na it will last long after this administration.
Okay, I think I jinxed it. Na-freeze na yung video ni Jonax.
Oo nga. What an unfortunate frame. Yan ba talaga?
Let's see, naka-freeze ka rin ba?
Oo. At also, a very unfortunate frame.
Let me get your final thoughts if you don't mind.
Hindi, ako, I agree with John Ax. It's not a numbers game. It's a lot of factors to consider. Obviously, yung what's happening or what happened with Inquirer, what's happening with Rappler and ABS-CBN, it's also a it's also very much a part of our current climate here in the Philippines for journalists. Mas ang mas worrisome, and maybe Jonax can add more after this, yung konsepto ng self-preservation. I think kasi yung problem natin ngayon sa media industry parang tatlo eh. Self-preservation, self-righteousness, and selfie. Yung self-preservation part is because of the constant attacks on media institutions here in the Philippines. We are sort of, yun nga, we always have to check ourselves kung nagsi-self-censor ba tayo sa mga balitang dapat nating ginagawa. Kasi iniisip natin, how do we survive this? So may nag-kick in a self-preservation. Yung self-righteousness, a lot of people, especially from our own ranks, parang would always parang go on this soapbox and sort of preach what journalism is or should be. Pero napaka-ivory tower na eh. Obviously, may problem tayo because yung pag-build ng ivory tower na yun, hinihiwalay natin yung sarili natin sa publiko, sa realidad ng publiko natin, ng Pilipinas. Kasi nga, kung ganun kataas yung distrust sa media, hindi ba dapat mas lumapit tayo at mas intindihin kung bakit humantong tayo sa ganito. And yung pangatlo, yung selfie, tingin ko parang in extreme cases lang dapat marami kasi masyado ngayon na yung journalist na nagiging part of the story or yung story tungkol sa kanila when rather it should be about the story. Diba? In extreme cases lang yung pwedeng parang maging part ka ng story. Pero I think yun nga, parang we have to go back to just making sure na it's not about us, it's about the story, which is very difficult, especially kung ikaw talaga yung story, gaya ng ABS-CBN or yung Rappler. Pero sa panahon na we have people fighting fake news, we also have to make sure we have to have people fighting for our audience, fighting to maintain or gain back that trust. Kung ano mang dahilan nila for not trusting our institutions or our industry, we sort of have to figure it out and find a solution. Kasi because we can do all the greatest stories and uncover the greatest anomalies, pero if we don't have the trust with the audience, yung public trust na yun, then what are the stories for, di ba? Kung hindi naman makakarating sa intended audience. Kung ganun, mamonolog ka lang.
Mm-hmm. All right. And on that note, that's all the time that we have for our show tonight. Thank you very much, my friends, Jeff and Jonax, joining us tonight. It's been more than 1 hour.
Don't forget to thank Ate.
Sino ka man, Ate. Thank you for joining our conversation.
Narinig ko yung ulam niya ngayon eh.
And we welcome you to our after show inuman. May inuman po kami after this. All right. All right. Again, thank you very much, Jeff and Jonax. And of course, thank you very much to those who tuned in to this episode of Viewpoint. Do catch us live here on Now You Know's Facebook page, on Twitter, and YouTube every Saturday at 6 in the evening. For updates on our upcoming episodes, please join our Facebook group. Just search for Viewpoint on Now You Know. Again, my name is Barnaby Lowe. This is Viewpoint. Now You Know.